2 years ago, I lived in Palestine. My apartment was here in Hebron, a conservative, mostly Muslim city in the heart of the West Bank. As you can probably tell by looking at me, I didn't exactly blend in. Luckily, Palestinians, by and large, are a warm, hospitable people, contrary to the stereotypes perpetuated online. In other words, I was welcomed with open arms. Fridays are reserved for prayer in Islam. So, while the pious people of Hebron were busy with their divine duties each Friday, I'd travel by public bus somewhere more lively. Bethlehem or Jerusalem were usually where I spent most weekends. But there was a catch. In order to get to Jerusalem from Hebron, I had to cross the wall. Now, the wall was built, and is still being built, by Israel to separate the West Bank from what it considers, Israel. It's an eyesore, that wall, 285 miles and counting of razor wire, trenches, and thick concrete, surveilled by the omniscient eyes of high-tech security cameras, and guarded by young but heavily armed Israeli soldiers. Crossing this fortified monstrosity was never fun. Inside, it was hot, sweaty. People were herded like cattle, corralled through foreboding corridors, and scowled at by sullen, gun-toting, usually teenaged Israeli soldiers. On the Palestinian side of the wall, I once met a woman named Rita. She and her husband invited me in for coffee one day. Rita had big brown eyes. Both her cheeks dimpled when she smiled, something she did often. She told me her favorite band was the Beatles, and her favorite season was late spring, when the bright yellow Persian buttercups start to bloom. And she told me, more than once, how much she loved her 9 grandchildren. As for the Israelis, all they want to do is kill us, is what she told me. Weeks later, this time on the Israeli side of the wall, I met Eddie. Eddie was Israeli. She had frizzy white hair, a plump, expressive face, and a very infectious laugh. I learned that she loved photography, her Siamese cat, and her 6 grandchildren. While talking about photography, I showed her a portrait I'd taken in Hebron. Then I asked if she'd ever been. To Hebron, she asked. No, of course not. They'd kill me there. That's weird, I thought, because Rita wouldn't want to kill Eddie, and Eddie wouldn't want to kill Rita. And yet, both were convinced of the other's bloodlust. Of course, Rita and Eddie weren't reflections of their respective governments. No, they were ordinary people. And for the most part, ordinary people on one side of a wall are no different than ordinary people on another. But being separated by a wall makes it easy to forget that. War erupted shortly after I left Palestine. The human cost has been seismic. Today, per conservative estimates, at least 60,000 Palestinians have been killed, with many more maimed and starving. Maybe the most surprising aspect of this bombardment, aside from hospitals, mosques, and refugee camps being carpet bombed on a daily basis, is what people have been saying about it online. See, I haven't been able to fathom the inhumanity of what's been done to the Gaza Strip and how anyone, anywhere, could justify it. Until I logged into Instagram. On social media, I encountered a whirlwind of ideological bile, puffed up political opinions being catapulted across digital enemy lines with no regard whatsoever for real people. People like Rita and people like Eddie. No middle ground, no nuance, no peace-mongering. Instead, bitter tribalism, like something from a college football rivalry. Now, do I blame the ongoing genocide in Gaza or even the October 7th massacre on Instagram? No. No, I do not. But I do blame social media for something else. I blame social media for, in its own way, being a wall. And like the Israeli wall in Palestine, social media is dividing us, making us afraid of one another, and, maybe worst of all, blinding us to our collective humanity. It's ironic, because, in theory, social media ought to be a bridge. You'd think social media would facilitate exposure to different viewpoints, cultures, and people. And that exposure, like, say, travel, would open us up, soften our often rigid beliefs, and chip away at the sort of prejudice that helps justify mass slaughter. Can social media still do those things? Yeah. But is it? Not really. Many of you are probably familiar with the following term, the algorithm. Now, the algorithm is basically how social media companies achieve their foremost objective. That is, keep you and I on their apps for as long as possible. In fact, most of what we see on social media is chosen by the algorithm. It does this by tracking everything we do online, what we like, watch, share, pause, or comment on. It then uses that information to feed us more of the same. If, for example, I click on one political video that happens to align with my viewpoint, I'll probably start seeing more political videos that also happen to align with my viewpoint. That's no coincidence. Over time, this repetitive process narrows our exposure, essentially trapping us in what is referred to as an echo chamber. In these echo chambers, opposing views are either distorted or drowned out, while our biases metastasize. The longer we're trapped, the more extreme the content tends to become. That's because the algorithm's goal isn't to keep us informed, no, it's to keep us scrolling. I'll give you an example. I went to college right here in Grand Junction. During my time as a CMU student, myself and a few peers conducted an unofficial experiment for one of our media classes. We started by creating a brand new YouTube account. And for 3 days, all we searched for was the Loch Ness Monster. Within hours, everything being recommended to us had to do with, you guessed it, the Loch Ness Monster. And the content being recommended to us was the most extreme, sensational, outlandish, clearly designed to hook us. Of course, it's one thing to be saturated with the otherwise benign topic of a mythical Scottish lake monster. But what about topics with real-world consequences? See, when we're constantly showing content that confirms our beliefs while depicting the other side of an issue as dumb, immoral, or worse, dangerous, it becomes much harder to understand, let alone sympathize with, different people and their perspectives. Multiply this phenomena across millions of users worldwide, and we find ourselves with a global population increasingly split into isolated echo chambers. Civil debate fades, empathy nosedives, tribalism becomes the norm. This is how social media can erase our humanity. Not to mention, being trapped in an echo chamber also makes us more vulnerable to propaganda. And now, with the help of artificial intelligence, that propaganda is only getting harder and harder to counter. This is the great irony, the great paradox of our era. For people with unprecedented access to information, we remain uniquely susceptible to being misled. Social media companies generally don't care about this. Because, once again, what matters is that we keep clicking, liking, sharing, scrolling, not whether any of it is actually true. I've seen firsthand how social media can divide people. I've seen it in the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, Europe, South Asia, but also right here in Western Colorado. Not too long ago, while writing for a political magazine, I was in Mesa County interviewing voters about what they thought of a certain congresswoman. One warm May evening, I went to interview a family of ranchers who agreed to go on the record for my story. Not only did they let me interview them, but they insisted I come inside. They fed me a delicious meal, asked if I wanted seconds, cracked me open a beer. In other words, they made sure I felt at home. They also detailed their vociferous hatred for people on the other side of the political aisle as them. They don't have the same morals, is what my host told me. As evidence, he fished his iPhone from his pocket, opened TikTok, and showed me a video montage of the other side doing all sorts of terrible, unspeakable things. I have no idea if that video was even real, but it was to them. A couple days later, I went to interview another family here in town. But this time, the couple I was going to interview were the political opposites of the ranchers. But, like the ranchers, this family welcomed me into their home. fed me a hearty breakfast, poured me black coffee on the back patio, where we sat with an unobstructed view of Mount Garfield. And they, too, used social media as evidence as to why the other side were a bunch of heartless lunatics. They don't share our values, is what my host told me. Sometimes, when I reflect on these moments, I'm not sure if I should laugh or curl up in the fetal position, paralyzed by cynical despair. How is it, I wonder, that two groups of friendly, welcoming people who live just a few miles apart can hate each other so deeply without having ever even met? And I also wonder what would change about those two families' beliefs if, instead of social media, their perceptions of one another were shaped on real interactions with real people, with each other. I can't say I have a solution, but what I can say is that it's harder to hate someone when they're a real person with a face, a name, and a story, not just an anonymous username online. It's easier to make someone your enemy when your perception of the world is filtered through a phone screen. But once you've actually sat with someone different from you, listened to their stories, eaten with them, laughed with them, talked with them about life, well, once that's happened, it becomes a bit harder to hate them, to hurl insults at them, to drop bombs on them. I'm not saying world peace can be achieved by putting down our phones and stepping away from social media, but it might not be a bad place to start. Thank you.